To understand Tsunade's story, you must first understand the weight of her name. Born into the Senju clan, she carried a legacy that stretched back to the very founding of Konohagakure. Her grandfather was none other than Hashirama Senju, the first Hokage, the man whose power and vision carved the hidden leaf from the chaos of warring states. To grow up as his granddaughter was to live under a shadow larger than life itself, a shadow of strength, leadership, and responsibility. Tsunade's childhood was shaped by this heritage. From the very beginning, expectations clung to her. She was not merely another shinobi child. She was Senju Tsunade, heir to a bloodline revered across the shinobi world. The Senju were known for their vitality, their willpower, their natural affinity for ninjutsu, and their deep connection to the will of fire. For Tsunade, this meant she was expected to inherit greatness, to become a leader, to wield immense power, to embody the ideals her grandfather had left behind. But legacies are not gentle. They press down, shaping and breaking in equal measure. To carry Hashirama's blood was to bear the burden of comparison. No matter what she achieved, whispers would ask, was it enough? Could she ever match the man who subdued the tailed beasts, who fought Madara Uchiha, who became the first symbol of unity for the shinobi world? These questions followed Tsunade even as a child, forming the invisible chains that tied her future to her past. What made Tsunade unique, however, was not simply that she was Hashirama's descendant, but how she chose to channel that legacy. Where many Senju excelled in combat, Tsunade's brilliance shone in medicine. From an early age, she demonstrated an unusual sensitivity to chakra control, an ability to manipulate her energy with precision rather than sheer force. This gift set her apart, and in time, it would allow her to revolutionize the very role of medical ninja in warfare. Yet, in her youth, it was another sign that she was different, not a replica of Hashirama, but something new. Her life was also shaped by the relationships that defined the Senju clan. Her younger brother, Nawaki, idolized the dream of becoming Hokage. He spoke of it with the same passion that Hashirama once carried, and Tsunade encouraged him, seeing in Nawaki a reflection of the family legacy. Their bond was tender, rooted in shared blood and the weight of expectation. At the same time, Tsunade's bond with Dan Kato, a man whose ideals mirrored Nawaki's, wove the threads of her destiny even tighter to the will of fire. These relationships would one day break her heart, but in her early years, they were the flame that guided her. As Tsunade grew, she began her training under the third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi. Alongside two teammates, Jiraiya and Orochimaru, she became one of his brightest students. The three were vastly different: Jiraiya, the reckless dreamer; Orochimaru, the ambitious prodigy; Tsunade, the sharp-minded powerhouse. Yet together, they would become known as the Sannin, the legendary three ninja, a title that defined their generation. Even here, though, Tsunade's role carried the weight of her lineage. Her power, her skill, and her sharp tongue all made her formidable, but behind them was always the whisper, granddaughter of Hashirama. Still, Tsunade never shrank from this weight. She carried it with a mixture of defiance and pride. Where others may have crumbled, she forged her own path. Her physical strength became legendary, her ability to shatter boulders and break through defenses unrivaled. Combined with her medical genius, she began to carve out an identity separate from her grandfather's. She was not Hashirama reborn. She was Tsunade, healer, fighter, gambler, woman of contradictions. The Senju legacy was not only about power, but about ideals. Hashirama had built Konoha on the belief that love and unity could break the cycle of endless war. Tsunade inherited this belief, though in her own way. Her dedication to medicine, Her insistence that every shinobi squad should have a medical nin came from the same root, a desire to preserve life rather than simply end it. This was her interpretation of the will of fire, not just to protect through strength, but to heal through knowledge. In this, Tsunade was every bit her grandfather's heir, though few at the time recognized it. Yet legacy is a double-edged sword. To carry the blood of Hashirama was to live with loss as well as pride. The Senju clan, once dominant, began to fade. By Tsunade's adulthood, the clan was no longer the force it had been in the Warring States era. Death and dispersal had weakened its numbers, leaving Tsunade as one of the last prominent heirs. The pressure of continuing that lineage weighed heavily on her, even as she resisted it. For someone who carried so much expectation, she was also deeply human, prone to vices, addicted to gambling, struggling with grief. In the end, Tsunade's childhood and early years can be summed up in one word: inheritance. She inherited power, expectation, and ideals. She inherited the will of fire, whether she wanted it or not. She inherited a name that carried both glory and chains. But what makes her story compelling is that she did not let that inheritance define her completely. She took it, reshaped it, and made it her own. The legacy of the Senju was not simply about what she carried, but about what she chose to do with it. And in Tsunade's case, those choices would lead her to become one of the most influential figures in Konoha's history, not because she lived in Hashirama's shadow, but because she dared to stand apart from it. Her story begins with legacy, but it does not end there. Tsunade's life would be defined by love, loss, rebellion, and return. She would break under grief, wander in exile, gamble away her days, and yet rise again to heal a village and guide a new generation. But before all of that, before Hokage and healing, before battles and war, there was the weight of being Senju Tsunade, granddaughter of the First Hokage, and the decision of what to do with that weight. Tsunade's story cannot be told without the other two figures who stood beside her during her formative years, Jiraiya and Orochimaru. Together, the three of them trained under the third Hokage, Hiruzen Sarutobi, a man renowned as the professor of ninjutsu. Hiruzen was not only a master of countless jutsu, but a teacher who saw potential in his students and nurtured it in his own way. For Tsunade, Jiraiya, and Orochimaru, he was more than a sensei. He was the bridge between the first and second Hokage's era and their own generation. From the beginning, the trio could not have been more different. Tsunade was sharp, confident, and blunt, her strength and medical genius already beginning to set her apart. Jiraiya was the reckless dreamer, prone to perversion, jokes, and a hunger for recognition that sometimes outweighed his discipline. Orochimaru was the prodigy, quiet, analytical, and brilliant, but carrying a darkness that even as a child made others wary of him. Their differences often clashed, but in those clashes a bond was formed. As a team, they represented balance. Tsunade's intellect and strength grounded Jiraiya's recklessness. Jiraiya's enthusiasm and optimism softened Tsunade's sharp edges. Orochimaru's precision pushed them both to refine themselves. Together, they trained, fought, and grew under Hiruzen's guidance, learning not only jutsu, but also the philosophy of the will of fire. Hiruzen instilled in them the belief that protecting others, even at great cost, was the highest duty of a shinobi. Each of them absorbed this lesson in different ways. Jiraiya with passion, Tsunade with practicality, Orochimaru with detachment. Their early missions tested them in ways that shaped who they would become. As children of war, They grew up in an era where shinobi were constantly sent to battle. Blood, loss, and hardship were not distant stories, but everyday realities. Tsunade, even as a young kunoichi, distinguished herself through her mastery of chakra control, using it not only for devastating strength, but also for medical purposes. She tended to her comrades when they were injured, her natural talent for healing already apparent. In a world that valued destruction, Tsunade quietly began valuing preservation. The trio's reputation grew over time, and with it, their bond deepened. Tsunade found herself constantly mediating between Jiraiya's impulsiveness and Orochimaru's cold pragmatism. She berated Jiraiya for his perversions, scolded him for his lack of focus, yet beneath the sharp words was a strange affection. With Orochimaru, her relationship was more complicated. She recognized his brilliance, but sensed the unsettling darkness beneath it. Even so, the three remained inseparable, not because they were alike, but because together they were complete. It was during the Second Shinobi World War that their names would be etched into legend. Sent to the battlefield like countless others, Tsunade, Jiraiya, and Orochimaru faced enemies as skilled and desperate as themselves. The war was brutal, and it was in its fires that the three of them earned their title. In a decisive battle against Hanzo of the Salamander, the leader of Amagakure, the trio fought valiantly but could not defeat him. Impressed by their resilience, Hanzo bestowed upon them the title of Sannin, the legendary three ninja of Konoha. Though given by an enemy, the title stuck, marking them as shinobi of extraordinary caliber. For Tsunade, this moment was a turning point. She was no longer simply Hashirama's granddaughter, no longer just one of Hiruzen's students. She was now one of the Sannin, her name known across nations. Yet, even in this recognition, her uniqueness shone. While Jiraiya and Orochimaru pursued power and fame, Tsunade pursued knowledge. Her work in medical ninjutsu became her greatest contribution to the war effort. She developed principles that would change the battlefield forever, declaring that every squad must have a medic, that healing was not an afterthought, but an essential strategy. In the bloodshed of war, she brought the hope of survival. Her philosophy was not abstract. It came from lived experience. Too many comrades died because no one was there to heal them. Too many missions ended in tragedy because injuries were ignored. Tsunade saw this clearly, and with the precision of a senju, she turned her conviction into practice. She trained herself relentlessly, mastering medical ninjutsu to a degree unmatched in her era. This mastery did not make her soft. In fact, it made her stronger. With chakra control honed through healing, she amplified her physical strength to monstrous levels, able to shatter stone with her fists. She became both healer and warrior, protector and destroyer. Within the Sannin, this duality set her apart. Jiraiya's strength came from summoning toads and his unyielding spirit. Orochimaru's strength came from forbidden techniques and relentless experimentation. Tsunade's strength came from balance. She could heal as well as she could fight, protect as well as she could destroy. Her presence on the battlefield was both terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying to her enemies, reassuring to her allies. She embodied what a shinobi could be when intellect and strength walked hand in hand. But beyond the battlefield, her bonds with her teammates continued to shape her. Jiraiya's affection for her grew, though she never fully returned it. Orochimaru's ambition deepened, pulling him further away from the ideals of the village. Tsunade, caught between them, became the grounding force, the one who carried the lessons of Hiruzen even as the others drifted. Their friendship was messy, complicated, filled with rivalry and affection. But it was real. The three of them were not only comrades, they were mirrors, reflecting each other's strengths and flaws. Looking back, the formation of the Sannin was not just the rise of 3 powerful shinobi. It was the crystallization of 3 philosophies. Jiraiya carried hope and faith in the next generation. Orochimaru carried ambition and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. Tsunade carried healing and the will to protect life. Together, they were legendary not only for their strength, but for what they represented. For Tsunade, this chapter of her life was about proving that she was more than her bloodline. She was no longer just the granddaughter of Hashirama. She was Tsunade of the Sannin, a kunoichi whose fists shattered stone, whose hands saved lives, whose name was whispered with awe and fear. Her bond with Jiraiya and Orochimaru tied her to Konoha's history, but her path was her own. And though tragedy would later break her spirit, in these years she was at her height, strong, proud, brilliant, a legend in her own right. The Sannin were forged in war, but what set them apart was not just survival. It was their ability to endure and to carry their names beyond the battlefield. For Tsunade, this endurance would soon be tested. Her bond with her teammates, her ideals of healing, and her strength as a Senju would all collide with the harshest losses of her life. But for now, she stood among legends, her fists steady, her mind sharp, her path carved not by her grandfather's shadow, but by her own choices. For all her strength, all her brilliance, all the pride that came from being one of the legendary Sannin, Tsunade's life was shaped most profoundly, not by victory, but by loss. Beneath the legend, beneath the gambler and the Hokage she would one day become, lies a woman whose heart was broken twice, in ways so deep that it altered the course of her life forever. To understand Tsunade, you must understand Nawaki. You must understand Dan. And you must understand how love and loss carved her path. Nawaki was her younger brother, the last hope for the Senju bloodline. He was bright-eyed, passionate, and carried a dream that resonated with their grandfather's legacy, the dream of becoming Hokage. Nawaki's words often echoed Hashirama's own, filled with a desire to protect the village and bring peace to those around him. Tsunade, who was older, saw in Nawaki the flame of youth, the kind of determination that could one day match the legacy of their family. She adored him, encouraged him, and believed he could achieve what he dreamed of. But war is cruel, and dreams are fragile. Nawaki never lived to see his vision through. On his 12th birthday, just after receiving a necklace once belonging to Hashirama from Tsunade, he was killed in battle. His death was sudden, brutal, and devastating. For Tsunade, the loss was more than the death of a brother. It was the death of hope. Nawaki had embodied everything good about the Senju legacy, and in a single moment, that flame was snuffed out. The necklace she had given him, a symbol of their bond and of their grandfather's will, became a reminder of failure and grief. The pain of losing Nawaki cut deeply, but fate was not finished with her. In time, she met Dan Kato, a man whose kindness and ideals reignited something within her. Dan was a shinobi who, like Nawaki, dreamed of becoming Hokage. He believed in protecting the village, in preserving life, in carrying the will of fire forward. To Tsunade, Dan was more than a lover. He was a second chance to see Nawaki's dream realized, a partner who shared her vision of a better future. In his presence, she found healing, companionship, and purpose. But the shinobi world is relentless. Dan too fell in battle, mortally wounded despite Tsunade's desperate attempts to save him. She poured every ounce of her medical skill into the effort, her hands trembling, chakra burning, determination unyielding. But even she, the greatest medic of her time, could not stop death. Dan died in her arms, and with him, Tsunade's heart shattered for the second time. The trauma was unbearable. The blood, the helplessness, the failure, it seared itself into her memory. From that day forward, Tsunade developed hemophobia, a crippling fear of blood. For the greatest medical nin in the world, it was a cruel irony. The sight of blood paralyzed her, trapping her in the memory of her losses. These twin tragedies defined the course of her life. Nawaki and Dan were not just loved ones. They were her reasons to believe, her connection to hope, her ties to the dream of Hokage. When they died, the dream died with them. Tsunade, once so proud, so fierce, so confident, became a woman haunted. Her strength remained, her genius remained, but her heart turned away from leadership. She could not bear to see another Hokage fall, could not bear to carry the responsibility of lives she might fail to protect. Her grief expressed itself in ways that seemed almost reckless. She left the village, wandering with her apprentice, Shizune. She buried herself in gambling, chasing fortune, only to lose again and again. Her addiction was not merely vice, it was a reflection of her life itself, a gamble she had already lost twice with Nawaki and Dan. She laughed, she drank, she played, but beneath it all was sorrow she could not escape. The necklace of Hashirama, once a family heirloom, became cursed in her eyes. Every person she gave it to died. To her, it symbolized the weight of loss she could never shed. And yet, even in exile, Tsunade remained Tsunade. Her brilliance in medicine, her monstrous strength, her sharp tongue and pride never vanished. But her heart was locked away, hidden beneath bitterness and fear. She mocked the title of Hokage, dismissed it as foolish, because to her, Hokage meant death. Hokage meant Nawaki. Hokage meant Dan. Hokage meant dreams that ended in blood. To protect herself, she rejected the dream altogether. This period of loss was perhaps the most human chapter of her life. She was not the untouchable Sannin. She was not the unyielding Fifth Hokage. She was a woman broken by grief, living in contradiction, carrying wounds that no amount of medical ninjutsu could heal. And it was in this brokenness that her future redemption became possible. For Tsunade could only find her way again when she was forced to confront these wounds, when a boy with bright eyes and a foolish dream of becoming Hokage reminded her of what she had once cherished. But before that encounter, before Naruto's determination reignited her faith, Tsunade wandered as a gambler and exile, haunted by ghosts. The deaths of Nawaki and Dan were more than personal tragedies. They were turning points that reshaped her identity, drove her away from Konoha, and left her paralyzed in body and spirit. These losses carved into her the contradictions that defined her. A healer who feared blood, a Hokage's heir who rejected the title, a woman of immense power who ran from responsibility. Love gave Tsunade hope. Loss took it away. And in the silence that followed, she drifted, carrying with her the weight of two dreams that had died too soon. In the history of shinobi warfare, there are countless names remembered for their destructive power, but far fewer remembered for their power to save. Tsunade of the Sannin was unique because she embodied both. With a single punch, she could shatter the ground, level walls, and terrify enemies. Yet, with the same hands, she could close wounds, knit flesh, and bring comrades back from the edge of death. It was this duality that made her a legend, not only as a warrior, but as the greatest medical ninja in the world. Before Tsunade, the role of medics in battle was limited and often overlooked. Injured shinobi were carried off the field, if they survived long enough. Entire squads were lost because no one could stabilize wounds in the heat of combat. Tsunade saw this flaw not just as a weakness in strategy, but as an affront to life itself. She had watched too many comrades die, too many young shinobi cut down because no one could save them. To her, the solution was not more destructive jutsu, but a fundamental shift in how shinobi approached battle. It was Tsunade who declared the principles that would define medical ninjutsu for generations. She laid down 4 clear rules that every medical nin must follow. Never stop healing allies until they are dead. Never die before your comrades. Never be on the front lines. And only break these rules when you've mastered the ultimate technique, creation rebirth. These rules were not just guidelines. They were a philosophy of survival. They transformed the battlefield, turning chaos into something that could be endured. Tsunade herself embodied these rules. Her chakra control was unmatched, precise enough to focus energy into healing even the gravest wounds. She could close gashes in seconds, mend broken bones, and stave off death long enough for comrades to continue fighting. In war, this meant that entire squads survived because of her presence. Shinobi who would have been lost lived to fight another day. Villages that might have fallen endured. In this way, Tsunade's strength was not measured only in battles won, but in lives preserved. But Tsunade did not stop at her own abilities. She believed that every squad, no matter how small, should include a medical nin. To her, it was not optional, but essential. Just as shinobi trained in combat arts, they must also train to preserve life. She drilled this principle into her students and into Konoha itself, reshaping the structure of its military. In time, her philosophy spread beyond Konoha, influencing the shinobi world at large. This was perhaps her greatest gift, not simply healing wounds, but changing the very way ninja fought wars. Her own mastery went beyond ordinary healing. With her chakra control, she developed monstrous strength, amplifying her physical strikes to devastating levels. By concentrating chakra into her muscles and releasing it in bursts, she could obliterate defenses with a single punch. Enemies who underestimated her because she was a healer quickly discovered that she was also one of the most dangerous fighters alive. This fusion of healing and combat made her unparalleled, the perfect balance of protector and destroyer. And then there was her ultimate technique, the strength of 100 seal and creation rebirth. By storing chakra over time in a diamond mark on her forehead, Tsunade could release it in battle to accelerate cell regeneration at an astonishing rate. Wounds that would kill another shinobi became trivial. Blades that pierced her body, strikes that shattered bones, all could be undone. For a time, she became nearly immortal, able to fight on without fear of death. Yet the technique carried a cost: shortened lifespan. Every use burned through her vitality, a sacrifice she accepted as the price of protecting others. This willingness to shorten her own life for the sake of others reveals the heart of Tsunade's healing philosophy. She did not heal because it was convenient. She healed because she believed it was the highest duty of a shinobi. Destruction could be taught to anyone, but the preservation of life required not only skill but compassion. Her grief over Nawaki and Dan, her fear of blood, her wandering years, all of these were wounds she carried, but they did not erase her belief in saving others. If anything, they sharpened it. Her impact was not only in the lives she personally saved, but in the generations she shaped. As Hokage, she would pass her teachings to Sakura Haruno, who carried her philosophy forward into the future. Through Sakura, Tsunade's medical principles reached the next generation, ensuring that her legacy did not fade with her own battles. This continuity proved that her philosophy was not merely personal but foundational. She had changed the shinobi world forever. What makes Tsunade's path as a healer so remarkable is the way it complemented her contradictions. She was a gambler who rarely won, yet when it came to medicine, she staked everything and refused to lose. She was a woman haunted by blood, yet she worked every day to overcome that fear in order to save others. She rejected the title of Hokage for years, yet her philosophy embodied the will of fire as strongly as her grandfather's. In her, we see not a perfect healer, but a human one, someone who fought through her flaws to protect those around her. The healer's path was not an escape from war. It was Tsunade's way of confronting it, by insisting that every squad have a medic, by pouring herself into her patients, by creating techniques that defied death itself. She ensured that war would never again consume lives as needlessly as it had taken Nawaki and Dan. Her grief became fuel for her vision, and her vision became a revolution. In the grand story of Naruto, Tsunade is remembered as a Hokage, as a Sannin, as a gambler, as a woman of strength. But perhaps her greatest identity is this: healer. The one who dared to say that life is worth saving, even in a world built on destruction. The one who turned the battlefield from a place of endless death into a place where hope could survive. And in this, she fulfilled the true legacy of the Senju, not through brute power, but through love, protection, and the refusal to let life be wasted. After the deaths of Nawaki and Dan, Tsunade could no longer look at Konoha the same way. The village that her grandfather had built, the will of fire that had once inspired her, now felt like a cruel reminder of dreams broken before they had a chance to bloom. Nawaki had died as a child, with his dream of Hokage still on his lips. Dan had died with the same dream, crushed in her arms, despite her desperate attempts to save him. For Tsunade, Hokage no longer symbolized hope, it symbolized loss. And with that loss came a fracture in her relationship with the village itself. She walked away from Konoha, not in rebellion, but in grief. With her apprentice, Shizune, by her side, she wandered the shinobi world, carrying her sorrow like a shadow. To those who encountered her, she was a paradox, a woman of legendary strength, a member of the Sannin, and yet someone who seemed to have no purpose beyond drifting. She drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and lived as if she no longer cared whether fortune smiled or frowned upon her. But beneath the laughter at a winning streak, or the curses at another inevitable loss, there was always the echo of grief. Her gambling habit became infamous. They called her the legendary sucker because she almost always lost. To Tsunade, the nickname didn't sting, it was fitting. Losing was all she knew. She had lost her brother, her lover, her faith in leadership, her place in the village. The dice and cards were just another way to act out the inevitability of loss. Each throw was a reminder that fate was cruel, that no matter how much one hoped or dreamed, it would all end in failure. And yet, she kept playing. Perhaps in the small chance of winning, she found a faint reflection of hope she could not bring herself to admit. But Tsunade was not only a gambler, she was also haunted by fear, a fear that cut deeper because it contradicted everything she had once stood for. After Dan's death, the sight of blood paralyzed her. Hemophobia became her curse, a cruel irony for the greatest medical nin of her time. In battle, blood was everywhere, unavoidable. For Tsunade, every crimson drop was a memory of Dan bleeding out in her arms, every wound a reminder of her failure. The woman who had revolutionized medical ninjutsu, who had saved countless lives, could no longer face the very thing she had sworn to heal. This fear made her retreat even further from the life she had once known. She did not return to Konoha, did not take on students beyond Shizune, did not involve herself in the affairs of nations. She became a wanderer, drifting from town to town, living on sake and chance. To many, it seemed she had wasted her talents. A Sannin, a Senju, a genius, reduced to a gambler with debts and a bottle at her side. But this was not waste, it was survival. To live with so much loss, Tsunade had to escape the reminders of what she had lost. Gambling dulled the pain. Wandering kept her away from memories. Fear kept her from facing her past. Through it all, Shizune remained by her side. Loyal, patient, and compassionate, Shizune acted as both student and caretaker. She saw the strength still buried within Tsunade and chose not to abandon her, even when Tsunade seemed determined to abandon herself. Their bond was one of quiet endurance, not flashy, not dramatic, but steady. Shizune's presence is proof that even in exile, Tsunade was never truly alone. She carried someone who believed in her, even when she could not believe in herself. Yet, for all her wandering, Tsunade could never fully escape who she was. In taverns and gambling halls, her monstrous strength was still feared. In whispers across villages, her name still carried weight. She may have tried to bury her legacy, but it followed her. The granddaughter of Hashirama. The healer who rewrote medical ninjutsu. The Sannin who fought Hanzo. No matter how much she tried to drown it in sake, her past clung to her. And deep down, perhaps, she knew she could not run from it forever. Her exile lasted for years, long enough that many in Konoha thought she might never return. Long enough that children grew up hearing her name as legend rather than reality. But exile was not the end of her story. It was a chapter of mourning, of denial, of survival. It was the darkness before the spark. For in time, Tsunade would be forced to confront everything she had fled from. The title of Hokage, the sight of blood, the hope she had buried with Nawaki and Dan. But in these wandering years, Tsunade was perhaps more human than ever. Not a symbol, not a Hokage, not even a healer. Just a woman broken by grief, walking through a world that kept reminding her of what she had lost. She was strong enough to survive, but not yet ready to heal herself. That would come later, when a boy with golden hair and a foolish grin would stand before her and remind her of dreams she had long abandoned. For now, she wandered. For now, she gambled. For now, she lived in exile, carrying the weight of loss, haunted by blood, hiding from the legacy that would one day call her back. Years passed with Tsunade drifting from place to place, her days defined by dice, sake, and debts. For those who whispered her name, she was still one of the Sannin, still the granddaughter of Hashirama, still the greatest medic in the world. But to those who saw her in person, she was a woman running from her past, a gambler with a sharp tongue and a bitterness that kept the world at arm's length. She had no intention of returning to Konoha, no intention of confronting her grief, no intention of ever wearing the mantle that had haunted her since Nawaki and Dan. But destiny does not care for intentions. When Hiruzen Sarutobi fell to Orochimaru during the invasion of Konoha, the village needed a new Hokage. Jiraiya, carrying his own grief for their teacher, sought out Tsunade. He knew she was the only one strong enough, respected enough, and capable enough to take the title of Fifth Hokage. And so, with Naruto by his side, Jiraiya set out to find her. The woman they found was not the one they expected. Tsunade sat in taverns, sake in hand, gambling away her money with a smirk and a curse when the dice betrayed her. Her reputation preceded her, but so did her reluctance. When Jiraiya raised the subject of Hokage, she dismissed it with laughter that cut sharper than a blade. To her, the title was cursed. Nawaki had wanted it and died. Dan had wanted it and died. To her, Hokage was not a dream, but a death sentence. She spat on the name, calling it foolish, mocking the idea that anyone would waste their life chasing it. Naruto, hearing this, could not stay silent. To him, the dream of Hokage was everything. It was the promise he had made to himself, the recognition he sought from a world that had shunned him. To hear Tsunade, one of the legendary Sannin, dismiss that dream as meaningless was unbearable. He confronted her, his words clumsy but sincere, his anger raw. For Tsunade, the boy's defiance was infuriating at first. Who was he to challenge her, this loud, brash genin who knew nothing of war, nothing of loss? And yet, beneath her irritation, something stirred. In Naruto's stubbornness, in the fire in his eyes, she saw a reflection of Nawaki, the same recklessness, the same refusal to give up, the same insistence that Hokage was a dream worth dying for. Memories long buried flickered in her mind, and for the first time in years, Tsunade felt the weight of hope pressing against the walls of her grief. Naruto's challenge did not end with words. When Tsunade mocked him, he made a bet. In a week, he would master the Rasengan, a jutsu of legendary difficulty. If he succeeded, she would acknowledge him and his dream. To Tsunade, it seemed impossible. To Naruto, it was the only way to prove himself. She agreed, smirking at the foolishness of it, certain she would win. But day after day, as Naruto struggled and stumbled, as he poured every ounce of determination into the task, she watched. Slowly, her laughter began to falter. Slowly, she began to see that this boy, against all odds, might truly remind her of what she had lost. Their encounter was not just about jutsu or bets. It was about belief. Tsunade, who had rejected Hokage, who had buried the will of fire beneath grief, was confronted with someone too stubborn to let it die. Naruto did not know Nawaki. He did not know Dan. But in his spirit he carried them both. He carried the same dream, the same unbreakable will. And in his eyes, Tsunade began to see the possibility of believing again. Jiraiya too watched this with quiet hope. He had known Tsunade for decades, had seen her at her strongest and her most broken. He knew her heart better than most, and he understood what Naruto's determination meant to her. The boy who shouted that he would be Hokage no matter what was exactly what Tsunade needed, a reminder that the dream she had abandoned still burned in others, still mattered, still lived. Yet, even as these threads began to weave, danger loomed. Orochimaru sought Tsunade as well, not to restore her faith, but to exploit her grief. He offered her the unthinkable, the resurrection of Nawaki and Dan, in exchange for healing his arms, crippled after his battle with Hiruzen. For Tsunade, the temptation was agonizing. To see her brother and her lover again, to undo the losses that haunted her, it was everything she had ever wanted. But it was also a trap, a betrayal of everything they had stood for. Naruto's presence during this time was critical. His defiance, his determination, his willingness to stand up even when beaten down, reminded her that resurrection was not the answer. Hope was not in the past, but in the future. Nawaki and Dan were gone, but their dreams lived on in the boy before her. And so, in the clash between grief and hope, Tsunade began to turn. Meeting Naruto was not just a chance encounter. It was the moment her exile ended, the moment her heart began to thaw. He forced her to confront the wounds she had buried, to remember the love and dreams she had tried to forget. In his foolish grin, his loud voice, his unshakable will, Tsunade found the spark that would reignite her faith in Konoha, in Hokage, and in herself. When Naruto stood before Tsunade and declared he would master the Rasengan in a single week, it sounded like the boast of a fool. The Rasengan was no ordinary technique. It was an advanced jutsu of terrifying precision, created by the Fourth Hokage himself. It required not just power, but perfect chakra control, the kind of discipline Naruto had never been known for. Tsunade smirked when she made the bet, fully convinced that the boy could not possibly succeed. To her, it was proof that his dream of Hokage was nothing more than childish arrogance. But what she had underestimated was not Naruto's skill. It was his determination. Each day, Naruto pushed himself to the edge of exhaustion. He stumbled, failed, and tried again. He carried balloons of water and rubber balls, learning to rotate chakra until his hands ached. He crashed and burned, literally at times, but never quit. To Tsunade, who watched from the sidelines, his efforts were baffling. Every rational thought told her he would fail, that he was wasting his time, that he was proving her right, and yet, every time he fell, he stood again. This stubbornness struck something deep within her. She remembered Nawaki's laughter, his reckless determination to be Hokage despite being so young. She remembered Dan's quiet conviction, his dream of becoming Hokage to protect the village he loved. And now, here was Naruto, shouting the same dream with the same fire. Tsunade had called Hokage a cursed title, a foolish pursuit that only led to death. But as she watched Naruto struggle, she felt her certainty begin to waver. The bet was not just about a jutsu, it was about philosophy. For Tsunade, the Rasengan symbolized the impossible dream, the mountain that could not be climbed. For Naruto, it symbolized his refusal to give up, his insistence that effort mattered more than doubt. Each attempt was not only training, but defiance. Defiance of Tsunade's cynicism. Defiance of the losses that had broken her. Defiance of the idea that Hokage was meaningless. Meanwhile, Tsunade's own heart was under siege from another direction. Orochimaru's offer lingered in her mind. To heal his arms, to betray Konoha, would mean seeing Nawaki and Dan again. For years, she had dreamed of that possibility, of undoing the grief that haunted her. The temptation was unbearable. Every night, she turned the thought over in her mind, weighing her longing against her duty. It was a cruel irony. The Hokage she had rejected came knocking in the form of a boy who reminded her of her past, while the man she despised offered her the only thing she still longed for. Naruto's training became more than a spectacle. It became the mirror against which Tsunade judged herself. Here was a boy who had lost everything, parents, acceptance, a normal life, yet refused to stop fighting for his dream. And here was Tsunade, who had once had everything, heritage, talent, comrades, yet ran from her own dream in fear. His resilience exposed her weakness. His hope challenged her despair. The moment of reckoning came when Naruto, battered and exhausted, stood tall and declared that he would become Hokage no matter what. He spoke not as a prodigy or a genius, but as someone too stubborn to quit. His words pierced through the armor Tsunade had built around her heart. For the first time since Nawaki and Dan, she felt the stirrings of belief. She remembered why they had dreamed of Hokage, why her grandfather had carried the will of fire, why the title mattered. It was not about survival, it was about enduring hope. And in that moment, Tsunade began to change. She began to see Naruto not as a foolish child, but as proof that the dream of Hokage was still alive. His Rasengan, though imperfect, was a promise. His determination was a reminder. His bet, which had seemed laughable, became a turning point. The bet with Naruto was more than a contest of skill. It was the battle for Tsunade's heart. For years, she had let grief and fear define her, mocking the very ideals she once cherished. But watching Naruto, she realized that dreams do not die with those who carry them. They live on in others, passed forward like a torch. Naoki's dream had not ended with his death. Dan's dream had not ended with his. They had been carried into Naruto, into his foolish grin, into his unbreakable spirit. By the end of that week, it no longer mattered whether Naruto's Rasengan was perfect. What mattered was that he had reminded her of who she was. What mattered was that he had reignited her faith in the will of fire. What mattered was that he had proven her wrong, not with victory, but with persistence. Tsunade, the woman who had wandered for years, who had gambled her life away, who had feared blood and cursed Hokage, began to believe again. Not in herself, not yet, but in the boy before her, who carried the same dream she had once watched die. The bet she had made to mock him had become the very thing that saved her. And though she would still have to face Orochimaru, though her decision to accept the Hokage mantle was not yet sealed, the path was now clear. Tsunade was no longer running. She was listening, remembering, and preparing to return. The bet with Naruto was the spark that lit the fire again, a reminder that even the deepest wounds can heal, a reminder that hope can be reborn in the unlikeliest of places. And for Tsunade, it was the moment her heart began to walk back toward Konoha. The days following Naruto's challenge left Tsunade at a crossroads. On one side stood Orochimaru, offering her the temptation she had longed for, the resurrection of Nawaki and Dan. On the other stood Naruto, stubborn and unyielding, carrying the same dream they once had. Between grief and hope, between past and future, Tsunade's heart was torn. Orochimaru's offer was insidious. He had lost the use of his arms after his battle with Hiruzen, his hands crippled by the sealing jutsu that took the third Hokage's life. He came to Tsunade not as the ruthless traitor she knew him to be, but as a supplicant in need of healing. In exchange, he promised to return the people she loved most. For years, Tsunade had buried her grief under sake and gambling, but deep down, the longing to see Nawaki and Dan again had never left her. Orochimaru's words struck directly at that wound. For a moment, she faltered. The thought of undoing her pain, of holding them again, of erasing the cruel twist of fate, it was almost unbearable, she considered it. She let the thought linger, turning it over in her mind. But the more she thought, the more the truth revealed itself. Nawaki and Dan had dreamed of Hokage, of protecting the village, of preserving the will of fire. To betray Konoha, to heal Orochimaru and unleash his destruction, would be a betrayal not only of the village, but of their memory. Orochimaru's offer was not salvation, it was desecration. Naruto's presence during this time was the counterweight. Every word he shouted, every bruise he earned in his Rasengan training, every defiant glare reminded her of what Nawaki and Dan had stood for. When she saw him, she no longer saw a foolish boy. She saw the same dream reborn, uncrushed by tragedy. Where she had let grief break her, Naruto endured. He embodied the will of fire in its purest form, not in speeches or philosophy, but in sheer, stubborn action. The confrontation could not be avoided. Orochimaru and Kabuto met Tsunade, demanding her decision. She appeared ready to comply, but in the final moment, her resolve hardened. She rejected them. She would not betray Konoha. She would not heal Orochimaru. She would not desecrate Nawaki and Dan's memory for the false comfort of resurrection. And in that rejection, she reignited the fire she thought she had lost. What followed was a battle that shook the earth, the Sannin clash. Tsunade, Jiraiya, and Orochimaru, once comrades under Hiruzen, now stood as enemies. The three legendary Sannin, fighting not side by side but against one another, embodied the paths they had chosen. Orochimaru, consumed by ambition, sought power at any cost. Jiraiya, loyal and steadfast, fought for the village and its future. Tsunade, once broken by grief, rediscovered her strength in protecting the boy who had reminded her of hope. The battle was fierce. Kabuto struck with precision, nearly killing Naruto and forcing Tsunade to confront her deepest fear. When blood flowed, she froze, her hemophobia overwhelming her. For a terrifying moment, it seemed she would fail again, but Naruto, lying injured, refused to give up. He pressed on with his Rasengan, defiant even at the edge of death. Seeing his courage, Tsunade broke through her fear. She moved, her strength returning in a surge of conviction. The woman who had once been paralyzed by blood now fought with ferocity, smashing Kabuto with her monstrous power and standing tall against Orochimaru. The climax came when Tsunade placed her body between Naruto and death. Orochimaru's blade struck, but she did not flinch. For years, she had run from responsibility, mocked the title of Hokage, cursed the dreams of her loved ones. But in that moment, she chose differently. She chose to protect. She chose to believe. She chose to carry the dream forward. Her words were simple, but carried the weight of her reborn conviction. Naruto would become Hokage, and she would stake her life on it. The battle ended with Orochimaru's retreat, his plans undone. Jiraiya and Tsunade, battered but victorious, stood once again as protectors of Konoha. And for Tsunade, the decision that had haunted her for years was finally made. She accepted the mantle of Hokage. Not because it was her destiny as Hashirama's granddaughter, not because it was expected of her as one of the Sannin, but because she chose it. She chose to honor Naoki and Dan. She chose to protect Naruto and the next generation. She chose to believe in the will of fire once more. When she returned to Konoha, she did so not as a gambler or exile, but as the Fifth Hokage. The villagers, who had known her only as legend, now saw her in flesh and blood. Her presence was both a comfort and a declaration. Konoha had lost Hiruzen, had suffered Orochimaru's invasion, had been shaken to its core, but with Tsunade's return, it found stability again. She carried with her not just strength, but the ability to heal the village, its people, and herself. Becoming Hokage was more than a political title. For Tsunade, it was redemption. It was the choice to stop running, to stop gambling with her life, to stop letting grief dictate her path. It was the choice to stand where Naoki and Dan could not, to protect the village they had loved, to ensure that Naruto's dream, and theirs, had a chance to live. When Tsunade returned to Konoha as the Fifth Hokage, the village was still scarred from Orochimaru's invasion. Buildings were reduced to rubble, lives had been lost, and morale was fragile. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage, had given his life to protect the leaf, and his absence was felt in every street, every household, every whispered conversation. The Hokage's seat was more than empty. It was a reminder of vulnerability. Into this void stepped Tsunade, the woman who had spent years wandering, gambling, and rejecting the very title she now carried. To many, her appointment was a gamble itself. Could someone who had turned her back on the village truly lead it? Could someone haunted by fear of blood protect others? Could someone as brash and unpredictable as Tsunade shoulder the weight of Hokage? These questions hung in the air as she walked through the village she had once abandoned. But Tsunade was no ordinary leader. She did not begin her reign with speeches or grand declarations. She began with healing. The first test of her leadership came with the condition of Konoha's shinobi. Many had been injured during Orochimaru's assault, their wounds untreated in the chaos. Tsunade moved swiftly, restoring order to the medical system she had once envisioned. She organized teams of medics, set up triage units, and personally treated those in critical condition. Her presence was more than practical, it was symbolic. The Hokage was not simply issuing commands from a tower. She was kneeling beside the wounded, her chakra flowing into their bodies, her hands saving lives one by one. This direct involvement quickly silenced doubters. The villagers and shinobi who had whispered about her gambling, her exile, her fear, now saw the truth. Tsunade was a healer above all else, and her strength was not only in fists that could shatter stone, but in hands that could mend life. Her philosophy of medical ninjutsu, once a theory, became reality at the highest level of leadership. Her role as healer extended beyond medicine. Konoha's spirit was wounded, its confidence shaken. Tsunade understood that healing meant more than mending flesh. It meant restoring hope. She reassured the people not with empty promises, but with action. She poured resources into rebuilding homes, repairing defenses, and supporting families who had lost loved ones. Every decision she made carried the same conviction. The village would endure, and she would stake her life on it. At the same time, she proved herself in battle. When Naruto and Jiraiya faced threats like Itachi and Kisame, and when later crises arose, Tsunade did not hesitate to act as both leader and warrior. Her strength reminded allies and enemies alike that Konoha's Hokage was no fragile figurehead. She could crush an enemy with a single blow, leap into combat with monstrous power, and defend her people with the same ferocity that had once earned her the title of Sannin. In Tsunade, the village saw not only a healer but a protector, someone who could stand in the front lines and lead by example. Her bond with Naruto grew during this time as well. She had once mocked his dream of Hokage, but now, as Hokage herself, she found inspiration in his relentless determination. She became both mentor and guardian, guiding him when needed, scolding him when he strayed, and protecting him when enemies came. In Naruto, she saw both Nawaki and Dan, but more importantly, she saw the future. He was proof that her choice to return, to believe again, had been the right one. Tsunade's early days as Hokage were not easy. She carried the weight of suspicion, the pressure of rebuilding, and the constant threat of enemies beyond Konoha's walls. But she faced these challenges with the same duality that defined her, fierce strength and compassionate healing. She was not Hiruzen, not Minato, not Hashirama. She was Tsunade, and her way of leading was uniquely her own. The turning point in the villagers' trust came not in speeches, but in survival. As she healed the wounded, restored the village, and defended it against new threats, the people began to see her not as the gambler who had abandoned them, but as the Hokage who had returned when they needed her most. Trust was not given, it was earned, and Tsunade earned it every day, with every wound she healed, with every life she saved, with every decision she made to keep Konoha alive. For Tsunade herself, these early days were also healing. She had carried grief for so long, had cursed the title of Hokage as nothing but a death sentence. But now, standing in that role, she began to see it differently. Hokage was not about death, it was about life. It was about carrying the will of those who had fallen and protecting those who remained. By becoming Hokage, she had not betrayed Nawaki and Dan. She had honored them. In healing the village, Tsunade began to heal herself. The title of Sannin was both a blessing and a curse. To the shinobi world, it was a mark of greatness, proof that Tsunade, Jiraiya, and Orochimaru were among the strongest of their generation, warriors who had survived wars and faced impossible odds. But to Tsunade, the title carried weight far heavier than glory. It bound her to two men who represented opposite ends of her past. Jiraiya, the comrade who loved her and never stopped believing, and Orochimaru, the friend turned traitor who embodied the betrayal of everything she had once held dear. The Sannin showdown was more than a battle. It was the collision of three paths that had begun together under Hiruzen Sarutobi and then diverged into radically different directions. Orochimaru sought immortality and power without restraint, willing to sacrifice anything for his ambition. Jiraiya walked the path of the Wanderer, choosing to guide the next generation while carrying the burdens of their era. Tsunade had fled into grief and exile until Naruto's determination reignited her faith. Their clash was not just about jutsu and strength, it was about what each of them had become. When Orochimaru extended his offer to Tsunade to bring back Nawaki and Dan if she healed his crippled arms, he knew he was exploiting her deepest wound. For years, Tsunade had lived in the shadow of their deaths, unable to escape the grief that consumed her. Orochimaru offered her the impossible, but it came at the price of betraying Konoha. For a moment, she hesitated. For a moment, she wavered. But in the end, she saw the truth. Nawaki and Dan had died as shinobi who loved the leaf. They would never have wanted her to betray it. And so, she chose to turn her back on Orochimaru, not on her village. The battle that followed was chaos embodied. Summons filled the battlefield. Jiraiya's great toad, Gamabunta, Orochimaru's serpent Manda, Tsunade's slug Katsuyu. Three titans clashed as their masters stood atop them. Old teammates, now enemies, their jutsu shaking the ground. For the shinobi world, it was a spectacle rarely seen. The legendary Sannin, once united, now locked in a fight that symbolized the fractures of their generation. For Tsunade, it was also a personal test. Kabuto struck with ruthless precision, targeting Naruto and nearly killing him. As blood spilled, Tsunade's body froze, hemophobia rooting her in place. Years of trauma surged back, paralyzing her at the moment she needed strength most. Kabuto mocked her weakness. Orochimaru smirked, and for a terrible instant it seemed the Fifth Hokage would crumble. But then she saw Naruto, battered, defiant, standing even when he should have fallen. He pushed forward with the Rasengan, his body screaming in pain, his will unbroken. In his determination, Tsunade saw everything she had lost, and everything she still had to protect: Nawaki, Dan, the will of fire. Naruto carried it all, and he refused to let it die. That sight shattered her fear. With a roar, Tsunade broke free of the chains of blood and grief that had bound her for years. Her fists struck with monstrous power, her healing hands saved the boy she had come to believe in, and her presence turned the tide of battle. Orochimaru, for all his ambition, could not overcome the renewed fire within her. Jiraiya, though weakened, fought at her side with unwavering loyalty. Together, the two Sannin, who still carried the will of fire, forced their former teammate into retreat. The Sannin showdown was not victory in the traditional sense. Orochimaru escaped, his ambition undimmed, his darkness still a threat, but for Tsunade, it was victory of another kind. She had faced her fear, stood against her grief, and declared herself Hokage not only in title but in spirit. She had proven to her enemies, to her comrades, and to herself that she was no longer running. She was Senju Tsunade, granddaughter of Hashirama, healer of Konoha, protector of the next generation. The clash also crystallized her bond with Jiraiya. For decades, he had carried a quiet love for her, a steadfast loyalty that never wavered, despite her rejection and exile. In this battle, they stood side by side again, not as broken comrades, but as pillars of the Leaf. Jiraiya's faith in her was rewarded, and Tsunade's respect for him deepened. Their bond was bittersweet, marked by years of loss and missed chances, but it was real. Her bond with Orochimaru, however, was severed. Once, he had been her teammate, someone she trusted and admired for his brilliance. Now, he was a shadow of that man, consumed by ambition and cruelty. Their clash was not simply physical, but ideological. A healer against a destroyer, a Hokage against a traitor, the will of fire against selfish immortality. In choosing to fight him, Tsunade closed the door on the possibility of his redemption in her eyes. He had crossed too far, and she would oppose him until the end. The Sannin showdown is remembered in history for its spectacle, the titanic summons, the clash of three legends, the raw display of power. But for Tsunade, its true meaning lay in what it restored. It restored her faith in Hokage. It restored her belief in the will of fire. It restored her strength to protect the village she had abandoned. And perhaps most importantly, it restored her to herself. In the end, the battle was not just about defeating Orochimaru. It was about reclaiming her place as Tsunade of the Sannin, as the Fifth Hokage, as the woman who could carry the dreams of the dead into the future. It was her declaration that she was no longer running, she was home. By the time pain descended upon Konoha, Tsunade had long since proven herself as Hokage. She had rebuilt the village after Orochimaru's assault, earned the trust of its people, and carried the weight of leadership through countless crises. Yet nothing could compare to the day the sky darkened with the eyes of the Rinnegan, and the village faced an enemy unlike any it had ever seen. Pain's attack was not merely a battle, it was judgment. To him, Konoha symbolized the cycle of hatred, the source of endless war. His plan was simple: annihilate the village to force the world to understand suffering. Against such devastation, even Tsunade, with all her strength and healing, faced a trial that went beyond fists and chakra. The assault began with chaos. 6 paths of pain swept through Konoha, each one a nightmare in its own right. Shinobi fell by the dozens, unable to comprehend the enemy's true nature. Buildings crumbled, fire and smoke filled the air, and panic threatened to consume the village. In the midst of this storm stood Tsunade, the Fifth Hokage, commanding, directing, and above all, protecting. She did not rush to the front lines with fists raised. She poured her chakra into the village itself, summoning Katsuyu to divide into countless fragments that spread across Konoha. Each fragment carried her chakra, healing the wounded, shielding the helpless, giving comfort to the terrified. It was an unprecedented act of sacrifice. Tsunade giving not only her strength, but her very life force to ensure the people of Konoha survived. This act revealed her essence as Hokage. Where others might have fought to destroy the enemy, Tsunade fought to preserve life. She understood that her fists could shatter stone, but her healing could save hundreds, and so she chose to stake everything on her role as protector. Every shinobi who stood back up, every civilian shielded from debris, every life pulled back from death was proof of her will. Yet sacrifice comes at a cost. As her chakra dwindled, her body weakened. wrinkles deepened, her youthful transformation faded, her strength faltered. She risked her own life, burning through her reserves, because for her there was no other choice. Hokage was not about survival. Hokage was about giving everything to protect the village. When Pain unleashed his ultimate devastation, the Shinra Tensei that leveled Konoha in a single, earth-shattering blast, Tsunade's efforts became both futile and essential. She could not stop the destruction. The village was reduced to rubble, its homes flattened, its people scattered. Yet because of her chakra, because of Katsuyu shielding them, countless lives were spared. Konoha itself was destroyed, but Konoha's people endured, and in the end, that is what mattered most. Her sacrifice left her broken. She collapsed into a coma, her body drained to the brink of death. To some, this seemed like failure, the Hokage who could not stop the destruction, who lay unconscious while her village burned. But to those who understood, it was the opposite. Without Tsunade, there would have been no survivors. Without her, the death toll would have been absolute. She had done what no one else could, shield the village from annihilation. Even in her absence, her will lingered. It was Tsunade who had trusted Naruto, who had believed in his dream, who had protected him even when others doubted. And when Naruto returned to face Pain, it was her faith that gave him the chance to fight. She had preserved the people, he would preserve their spirit. Together, though apart, they embodied the will of fire. The aftermath of Pain's invasion reshaped everything. Konoha was reduced to ruins, its people grieving and broken. But thanks to Naruto's confrontation with Nagato, thanks to his refusal to abandon hope, the fallen were revived. And when Tsunade awoke from her coma, she saw the village not in despair, but in renewal. The will of fire had endured, carried by the next generation she had believed in. Pain's invasion was Tsunade's greatest trial as Hokage, not because she defeated the enemy, she did not, but because she embodied the true essence of her role, to protect her people at any cost. She gave everything, even to the brink of death, and in doing so proved that Hokage is not defined by victory, but by sacrifice. For Tsunade herself, the invasion was also healing in its own way. It showed her that she was no longer the woman who ran from loss, who mocked Hokage as cursed. She had faced devastation head-on and chosen to protect. She had honored Naoki and Dan not by resurrecting them, but by living their dream. And she had passed the torch to Naruto, the boy who reminded her why she returned in the first place. The village was destroyed, but its heart beat on. And for Tsunade, that was enough. When Tsunade awoke from her coma after Pain's invasion, the world had already changed. Konoha was in ruins, yet it was alive. The people she had poured her chakra into had survived. Naruto had faced Pain, not with fists of destruction, but with words of understanding, and in doing so had carried the will of fire further than she ever could have imagined. For Tsunade, awakening was a reminder that her faith had not been misplaced. She had believed in Naruto, in his reckless determination, in the dream of Hokage he carried, and he had proven her right. But there was little time for rest. The Akatsuki still loomed, their hunt for the tailed beasts intensifying. Madara Uchiha had stepped from the shadows, declaring a war that would consume the entire shinobi world. For the first time in history, all 5 great villages faced a common enemy. And for Tsunade, this meant stepping not only into the role of Hokage, but into something larger, a leader among leaders, the voice of Konoha on the world stage. Her recovery was swift, though it came with the price of strain. She had given nearly everything during Pain's invasion, and her body bore the cost. Yet her spirit was unshaken. The woman who once fled from blood now stood ready to face war. She returned to the Hokage's seat with renewed conviction, aware that the days ahead would test not just her strength, but her ability to guide an entire generation of shinobi into a conflict unlike any before. The Five Kage summit became her proving ground. Alongside Gaara of the Sand, Noki of the Stone, A, the Raikage of the Cloud, and Mei of the Mist, Tsunade stood as Konoha's representative. The summit was fraught with tension. Old wounds lingered between the villages, mistrust woven into their histories. But Tsunade understood what was at stake. Alone, no village could stand against the Akatsuki's might. Divided, they would fall. Together, they had a chance. In those discussions, Tsunade's voice was fierce, commanding, uncompromising. She did not beg or plead for unity, she demanded it. She reminded the other Kage that the survival of their nations depended not on grudges, but on cooperation. The will of fire, once a philosophy confined to Konoha, became her argument for a global alliance. Protecting the future, protecting the next generation, this was no longer Konoha's duty alone, but the duty of all shinobi. Her interactions with the other Kage revealed both her strengths and her humanity. With Gaara, she saw the reflection of Naruto's influence, a young leader shaped by bonds rather than hatred. With Noki, she clashed, but found common ground in their shared responsibility as elders guiding the young. With A, she stood toe-to-toe with his stubbornness, refusing to let his anger cloud reason. With Mei, she found an ally who understood the weight of leading in turbulent times. Through these exchanges, Tsunade proved herself not only as Hokage, but as a stateswoman, capable of uniting even the most divided voices. Back in Konoha, preparations for war consumed her every hour. The village was still rebuilding, yet shinobi were needed on the front lines. She oversaw the coordination of troops, the distribution of resources, the strengthening of medical divisions. True to her philosophy, she emphasized the role of medics, ensuring that every unit had the means to survive the coming storm. Her foresight and discipline reshaped the way Konoha approached battle, making survival as important as offense. But Tsunade's leadership was not only logistical, it was personal. She visited shinobi, preparing to march into war, offering words of encouragement, placing faith in their abilities, reminding them that their sacrifices mattered. For a generation that had grown up under her tenure, her presence was a source of stability. The Fifth Hokage, once mocked as a gambler and exile, was now the steady flame at the heart of Konoha. Her preparations were also marked by the knowledge of what she risked. She had already nearly given her life during Pain's invasion. She knew the war could demand even more, yet she did not hesitate. She carried within her the memory of Naoki and Dan, the dream they had died for. She carried the trust of Naruto, the boy who reminded her that dreams never truly die. She carried the will of fire, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived reality, the determination to give everything so that the next generation could inherit peace. The war was inevitable, but Tsunade ensured that Konoha would not enter it broken. She rebuilt, she healed, she planned, and she united. And when the time came to march, Konoha's shinobi walked with her will in their hearts. War preparations are often unseen in the grand stories of battle, overshadowed by the explosions and victories that follow. But in Tsunade's case, they revealed her true strength. Not just in fists or jutsu, but in vision, in leadership, in the ability to turn grief into resolve, despair into unity, and a broken village into a fighting force, ready to face the greatest threat the shinobi world had ever known. The Fourth Great Ninja War was unlike any conflict Tsunade had ever faced. It was not the chaos of small skirmishes, nor the brutality of the Second Shinobi War, where she had earned her name as one of the Sannin. This was a war on a scale so vast that the very future of the world seemed to hang in balance. Shinobi from every land, once divided by hatred and blood, now stood side by side. And at the heart of it all, carrying the burden of her people, stood Tsunade, the Fifth Hokage. For Tsunade, the war began not with fists or jutsu, but with responsibility. As one of the 5 Kage, she sat at the council that decided the course of battle, lending her voice to the strategies that would decide the survival of nations. She emphasized the need for medical divisions, reinforcing the philosophy she had carried since her youth. Every squad must have a medic. Every life mattered. Her insistence saved countless shinobi before the war had even begun, for the infrastructure she created allowed soldiers to survive wounds that would have once been fatal. But Tsunade was never content to remain behind the lines. When Madara Uchiha emerged onto the battlefield, summoned through Edo Tensei in all his terrifying power, she stood alongside the other Kage to face him directly. The sight of him was enough to chill the heart. The founder of the Uchiha clan, the rival of her grandfather, a man whose very name was legend. For Tsunade, it was more than a battle. It was history repeating itself. Hashirama had once fought Madara to shape the future of the shinobi world. Now, generations later, Tsunade found herself carrying that same burden. The battle was a storm. Madara moved with overwhelming power, his Susanoo blotting out the sky, his wood style mirroring the abilities of Hashirama himself. Even the combined strength of the 5 Kage struggled to keep pace. Blades of chakra fell like meteors, forests rose and crumbled in the span of moments, and the ground itself groaned under the weight of their clash. Against such an enemy, even Tsunade, with her monstrous strength and medical genius, was pushed to her limits. Yet it was in this crucible that her will shone brightest. While the others unleashed devastating jutsu, Tsunade stood as both shield and sword. Her strength of 100 seal, released in full, allowed her to heal wounds that would have killed anyone else. Blades pierced her body, bones broke, blood flowed, but each time she regenerated, rising again to strike. She did not fight only with power. She fought with endurance, with the refusal to fall, with the conviction that Hokage meant never yielding, while her people still stood behind her. Her presence on the battlefield was not only physical, but symbolic. She fought not as Hashirama's granddaughter, not as one of the Sannin, but as herself, Tsunade, the Hokage, who had once fled from loss, but now stood unshaken in its face. Her fists shattered Madara's constructs. Her healing kept the Kage alive longer than anyone thought possible, and her voice commanded with the weight of unbreakable resolve. There was a moment during the battle when Madara looked at her and saw Hashirama's blood flowing in her veins. He mocked her, dismissing her as weaker than her grandfather, unworthy of comparison. But Tsunade did not flinch. She did not need to be Hashirama. She was herself, and in her strength, in her healing, in her refusal to surrender, she proved that her legacy was not bound by her grandfather's shadow. She fought not to rival the past, but to protect the present and future. Still, the battle was brutal. Madara's power was overwhelming, and even united, the Kage suffered greatly. Tsunade herself was torn apart, her body pierced and broken, her life hanging by a thread. And yet, even then, she refused to die. Her healing continued even as consciousness wavered, her will alone keeping her alive when her body had nothing left to give. It was the culmination of her philosophy, to preserve life at any cost, even her own. Her role in the war extended beyond that battlefield. While Naruto and the allied forces fought the resurrected armies of the Akatsuki, while Sasuke carved his own bloody path, Tsunade's will was felt in every division. Her medical infrastructure kept shinobi alive. Her leadership gave them confidence. Her endurance against Madara showed them that even legends could be challenged. The Fourth Shinobi War tested every leader, every soldier, every village. For Tsunade, it was the final trial of her era. She had once rejected the Hokage title as cursed. Now, in the face of annihilation, she proved what Hokage truly meant. It was not about power alone, nor about victory in every battle. It was about sacrifice, about refusing to surrender, about giving everything so that the next generation could inherit a chance at peace. When the war finally ended, when Madara fell, when Kaguya was sealed, when the world drew breath again, Tsunade's role faded into the background. She was no longer the one throwing the final blow, no longer the one at the center of victory, but she had been the pillar that allowed it to happen. Without her, the shinobi world would have crumbled before it could rise. Without her, the next generation would not have had the chance to stand. The war was the culmination of Tsunade's path. From grief and exile to belief and leadership, she had walked the long road back to her grandfather's legacy, not by mimicking him, but by embodying her own truth. And in the crucible of battle, she proved that even broken hearts can endure, that even those who fear loss can choose to protect, and that the will of fire burns brightest when the darkness is deepest. When the dust of the Fourth Shinobi War finally settled, the shinobi world entered an era it had not known in generations, an era of peace. The enemies had been defeated, the cycles of hatred broken, at least for a time. For Konoha, the fires of battle had dimmed, and the village began once more to rebuild not just its walls, but its future. For Tsunade, the war had been both culmination and conclusion. She had given everything as the Fifth Hokage, had stood at the center of crisis after crisis, had carried her people through devastation. Now, at last, she faced the moment all leaders must eventually face, the decision to step aside. Her time as Hokage had been defined by sacrifice. She had rebuilt the village after Orochimaru's invasion, given her life force to protect it during Pain's attack, and stood unyielding against Madara Uchiha alongside the other Kage. She had lived through the worst and carried the burden of command at her own expense, but peace required something different, not just strength, but renewal. And Tsunade knew that the next era belonged to a new generation. In choosing to step down, she was not abandoning her duty, but fulfilling it. Leadership is not meant to last forever. Even her grandfather, Hashirama, had understood that the Hokage's seat must pass to those who come after. For Tsunade, the decision was bittersweet. She had once rejected the title, mocked it as cursed. Then she had embraced it, lived it, and given it her all, aftes. Now she entrusted it to others, confident that the will of fire she had rekindled would continue to burn. Her legacy as Hokage did not end with her resignation. It lived on in the systems she had built and in the people she had shaped. The medical corps she had insisted upon remained a cornerstone of every division, her philosophy of healing woven permanently into the shinobi world. More personally, her teachings had taken root in her student, Sakura Haruno. Under Tsunade's guidance, Sakura had grown from a girl uncertain of her abilities into a healer and warrior of extraordinary caliber. With her strength of 100 seal, and mastery of medical ninjutsu, Sakura became the living proof of Tsunade's legacy. For Tsunade, seeing Sakura rise was more than professional pride, it was healing. In Sakura, she saw a continuation of everything she had fought for, the blending of strength and compassion, the ability to destroy and to save, the courage to carry others on her shoulders. Where once she had feared blood, Sakura faced it with unflinching resolve. Where Tsunade had carried grief, Sakura carried hope. And in passing her teachings to her student, Tsunade passed the torch not just to a successor, but to a reflection of herself made new. Life after Hokage was quieter, but no less meaningful. Tsunade was still Tsunade, the gambler, the drinker, the woman with a sharp tongue and a wit as cutting as her fists. But she was no longer a wanderer fleeing her past, nor a leader weighed down by fear of failure. She was at peace with who she was, at peace with what she had given. The ghosts of Nawaki and Dan no longer haunted her as wounds. They lived on as memories, honoured in the choices she had made, fulfilled in the village she had protected. Her bond with Naruto also deepened in this era. He, more than anyone, had reminded her of what it meant to believe. She had once mocked his dream, but he had proven her wrong in every way. Watching him grow from a brash genin into a hero of the shinobi world was a source of pride that softened the edges of her cynicism. She had believed in him when others doubted, and he had surpassed even her expectations. In him, the torch of Hokage would one day burn again, brighter than ever. For Tsunade, passing the torch was not about fading away. It was about continuity. The will of fire had been passed from Hashirama to Hiruzen, from Hiruzen to her to Kakashi, and eventually to Naruto. Each carried it differently, but each ensured it endured. Tsunade's role in that chain was essential, not because she was perfect, but because she was human, flawed, broken, yet unyielding. She showed that even those who fear, even those who run, even those who gamble and lose, can still rise to protect what matters. Her later years were marked by a rare kind of freedom. No longer bound by the seat of Hokage, she could live as herself. She travelled again, but now not as an exile, not as a woman running from grief, but as someone who had fulfilled her duty. She spent time with Shizune, with the younger generation, with those who reminded her that life was more than war and loss. And though her hair turned grey and her body slowed, her spirit remained fierce. She was Tsunade, Sannin, healer, Hokage, Senju, and nothing could take that away. Passing the torch was the final proof that her story was not about loss but about renewal. Nawaki and Dan had died, but their dream lived on in her. She had feared Hokage as a curse, but she had worn the title with honour. She had once been paralysed by blood, but she had fought through it to protect countless lives. And in the end, she gave that legacy to those who came after, ensuring that her story would never be the end, but always a beginning. When Tsunade awoke from her coma after Pain's invasion, the world had already changed. Konoha was in ruins, yet it was alive. The people she had poured her chakra into had survived. Naruto had faced Pain, not with fists of destruction, but with words of understanding, and in doing so had carried the will of fire further than she ever could have imagined. For Tsunade, awakening was a reminder that her faith had not been misplaced. She had believed in Naruto, in his reckless determination, in the dream of Hokage he carried, and he had proven her right. But there was little time for rest. The Akatsuki still loomed, their hunt for the tailed beasts intensifying. Madara Uchiha had stepped from the shadows, declaring a war that would consume the entire shinobi world. For the first time in history, all 5 great villages faced a common enemy. And for Tsunade, this meant stepping not only into the role of Hokage, but into something larger, a leader among leaders, the voice of Konoha on the world stage. Her recovery was swift, though it came with the price of strain. She had given nearly everything during Pain's invasion, and her body bore the cost, yet her spirit was unshaken. The woman who once fled from blood now stood ready to face war. She returned to the Hokage's seat with renewed conviction, aware that the days ahead would test not just her strength, but her ability to guide an entire generation of shinobi into a conflict unlike any before. The Five Kage summit became her proving ground. Alongside Gaara of the Sand, Noki of the Stone, A, the Raikage of the Cloud, and Mei of the Mist, Tsunade stood as Konoha's representative. The summit was fraught with tension. Old wounds lingered between the villages, mistrust woven into their histories. But Tsunade understood what was at stake. Alone, no village could stand against the Akatsuki's might. Divided, they would fall. Together, they had a chance. In those discussions, Tsunade's voice was fierce, commanding, uncompromising. She did not beg or plead for unity, she demanded it. She reminded the other Kage that the survival of their nations depended not on grudges, but on cooperation. The will of fire, once a philosophy confined to Konoha, became her argument for a global alliance. Protecting the future, protecting the next generation, this was no longer Konoha's duty alone, but the duty of all shinobi. Her interactions with the other Kage revealed both her strengths and her humanity. With Gaara, she saw the reflection of Naruto's influence, a young leader shaped by bonds rather than hatred. With Noki, she clashed, but found common ground in their shared responsibility as elders guiding the young. With A, she stood toe-to-toe with his stubbornness, refusing to let his anger cloud reason. With Mei, she found an ally who understood the weight of leading in turbulent times. Through these exchanges, Tsunade proved herself not only as Hokage, but as a stateswoman, capable of uniting even the most divided voices. Back in Konoha, preparations for war consumed her every hour. The village was still rebuilding, yet shinobi were needed on the front lines. She oversaw the coordination of troops, the distribution of resources, the strengthening of medical divisions. True to her philosophy, she emphasized the role of medics, ensuring that every unit had the means to survive the coming storm. Her foresight and discipline reshaped the way Konoha approached battle, making survival as important as offense. But Tsunade's leadership was not only logistical, it was personal. She visited shinobi, preparing to march into war, offering words of encouragement, placing faith in their abilities, reminding them that their sacrifices mattered. For a generation that had grown up under her tenure, her presence was a source of stability. The Fifth Hokage, once mocked as a gambler and exile, was now the steady flame at the heart of Konoha. Her preparations were also marked by the knowledge of what she risked. She had already nearly given her life during Pain's invasion. She knew the war could demand even more, yet she did not hesitate. She carried within her the memory of Naoki and Dan, the dream they had died for. She carried the trust of Naruto, the boy who reminded her that dreams never truly die. She carried the will of fire, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived reality, the determination to give everything so that the next generation could inherit peace. The war was inevitable, but Tsunade ensured that Konoha would not enter it broken. She rebuilt, she healed, she planned, and she united. And when the time came to march, Konoha's shinobi walked with her will in their hearts. War preparations are often unseen in the grand stories of battle, overshadowed by the explosions and victories that follow. But in Tsunade's case, they revealed her true strength. Not just in fists or jutsu, but in vision, in leadership, in the ability to turn grief into resolve, despair into unity, and a broken village into a fighting force, ready to face the greatest threat the shinobi world had ever known.